What's up everybody, it's Joe with J Lake Photo. In today's video, we're gonna get deep into a conversation about Intel processors, specifically Alder Lake, whether or not it has the chops to take on Apple and the M1 Pro and M1 Max mobile processors. Okay, real quick before we get into today's video, just a quick plug for the channel. I'd appreciate it if you're interested in conversations about tech, about photography, videography, drones, gear, gadgets, all that sort of thing. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button and go ahead and like this video if it's the kind of thing that you're into. I'd also appreciate it if you'd hit the bell so that you get notified when I put out new videos. Also, real quick, if you're into stills photography, go ahead and find me over on Instagram. I am at jblakephoto. Okay, that's enough, that's it. That's the only plug for the channel that I'm gonna do until the very end, I promise. But before we jump into the video, I do wanna warn you, big nerd alert. We're gonna get deep into talking about these processors. So if you're not super into CPU architecture, then this might not be the video for you. If you are a content creator, either professionally, amateur, just for fun, maybe it's your 9 to 5, if you're a videographer, a photographer, if you're a programmer, if you do creation and processing power and mobility are important to you, this is going to be an important video for you. So before we talk about comparing these two processors and these scores that we have, let's talk a little bit about these processors themselves and their underlying architecture, starting with the Intel processor. Now, the Alder Lake processors have been kind of on their way out the door into the market this year. This is the 12th gen Intel Core processor, and it is being manufactured on the 10 nanometer FinFET process, which Intel calls Intel 7. Intel 7 specifically being a way to differentiate Intel's 10 nanometer process from their previous 14 and 14 plus nanometer process, to compare more favorably against the Apple 5 nanometer process or some of the other processes that are out there from other manufacturing companies. And the one thing to remember is that none of these processors are actually built on those standards. Most of them are a mix of different measurements. Those measurements really don't matter as it relates to today's kind of real world performance, but what you can know is that going from 14 to 10 or 10 to 7 or 7 to 5 or 5 to 3 means better, right? Smaller means better. So Intel going to the 10 nanometer FinFET process, it's going to be improved performance for the power. You're going to be able to pack more transistors, more components, more capability into a smaller space, and it's going to require less power to function. On the Apple side of things, you have the M1, M1 Max, M1 Pro chips that are on the 5 nanometer process, and Apple does not manufacture their own chips. They use TSMC based out of Taiwan to manufacture their chips. All right, so Intel's Alder Lake processors are a departure for Intel. If you've watched Intel over the last 11 generations, they have really kind of two components of their processors. Number one, the number of cores, and number two, hyper-threading. Now mix in with that graphics, L2, L3 cache sizes and speeds, as well as features and other performance. But when you're looking at the big change here from the current processor, the 11th generation to the 12th generation, the big change with Alder Lake is that instead of just throwing more cores or faster cores or more cache into these processors, they are completely changing the architecture. They're changing the kind of design layout of these chips. They're still x86 64 based chips, but they are, instead of being, just 12 chips or 12 cores or 10 cores or 8 cores or 6 cores with hyper-threading and 12 threads, 10 cores with hyper-threading, 20 threads. The Alder Lake chips are coming in what's called a hybrid configuration or a big little configuration. Now, this is going to sound very familiar because it's something that you've seen in mobile processors from Qualcomm and specifically from Apple and ARM-based chips for quite some time. The idea here is that if you create a processor that has multiple cores, but those cores are not all operating in exactly the same way, some of them are designed to do different things, you can then better optimize for specific workloads at specific times for the user. So the Alder Lake processor has in it up to 8 what are called performance cores. So these are your big cores, and up to 8 additional what are called efficiency or high efficiency cores. So you have these performance cores that take a lot of power, they can do a lot of heavy compute, and then you have these smaller, far lower power consuming efficiency cores that can do more simple productivity style tasks. Now there are loads of reasons why this can be beneficial. One example would be, let's say that you are a Twitch streamer and you want to be able to use your high performance cores, your 8 high performance cores, to manage the game that you're playing, highest frame rates, so that you get clean gameplay, while the low power, high efficiency cores can handle things like, background tasks, or they can also handle, in some cases, your actual streaming on that same chip. And those two components, those two sets of cores, will not interrupt each other, and they won't cause performance issues between the two. They can hand off those things. Another example would be if you were doing video editing and you wanted to set a project to render, or you wanted to have assets that were building proxy files, and you wanted to do email, or you wanted to maybe do some light photo editing or something on the other side, you could then use your performance cores, your lower power cores, at the same time. All of this while maximizing battery life, specifically in the mobile space, and also maximizing the die space on your processor and the amount of power that your CPU is going to use. Now, in the 12th generation Intel Alder Lake processors, we have a completely new set of cores. So the new high performance cores in the new Alder Lake processors are Golden Cove. So we've got Alder Lake, and inside Alder Lake is Golden Cove. So in the Golden Cove of Alder Lake are where you're going to find your high performance, your 8 high performance cores, up to 8 depending on the configuration of the CPU. And these cores are coming with 6 wide instruction decoders. That's up from 4 instruction decoders from the previous Tiger Lake, the 11th generation CPUs from Intel. At the same time, these decoders can actually process double the amount of information per instruction. So a wider set of instruction decoders, and they can handle more information per instruction. At the same time, a number of other instruction components of this chip, of this particular core, have been increased between 25 and 30% to give you a pretty decent per clock improvement, an 18% improvement per clock, meaning for every cycle of the chip, right? When you look at megahertz and gigahertz, for every cycle of the chip, you're going to get about an 18% improvement in performance on these cores versus previous cores in the Tiger Lake 11th series. Now, by itself, just 8 cores or 6 cores, which they will in some cases sell these by themselves, these P cores, these performance cores built on Golden Cove in Alder Lake, these are going to be where most of your heavy lifting is done. But the advantage to this system, the advantage of this new big little configuration, is the fact that in addition to Golden Cove, we have Gracemont. I don't know where Gracemont lands in the water analogy of Alder Lake and Golden Cove. Tell me down in the comments if that makes any sense to you. But Gracemont is where the high efficiency or E cores, right? So you have P cores and you have E cores. So the E cores, or the high efficiency cores, are the ones that are going to do your kind of background tasks, your lower throughput required tasks, to be able to let you get that stuff done, while your performance cores are either off chewing on video or photos or other instructions that are higher bandwidth. And yet you can still manipulate these other cores to do kind of lower end tasks and not completely crush your battery, or run just on those E cores while keeping the P cores completely silent and turned off, and extend your battery out considerably. Again, many of these philosophies come from the mobile world. And these chips come in kind of three different variations, three different package concepts. One is the S, which is going to be your high performance desktop chips. These are the ones with 8 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores, all the way down to, in some cases, 6 performance cores and no efficiency cores. Again, if you're working on a desktop, you might not necessarily need the power benefits that you get from the efficiency cores, and you might just want flat performance. You're not doing any productivity work, you're just doing editing and crunching numbers and all this high bandwidth work, so you don't need that extra stuff. So there will be a range in that S lineup for those. Then you have your mobile lineup. That's your P variant, and the P variant will come in a multitude of configurations, including 6 performance cores and 8 high efficiency cores. One thing to note here is that the performance cores do include hyperthreading, which is Intel's virtual threaded microarchitecture, where each core can actually operate effectively two instructions per, or 2 threads per core clock. Meaning that you can actually end up getting a chip that, while it is 1 core, it can do 2 threads. So if you have a chip with 8 P cores and 8 E cores, the P cores can do 2 threads each. So you'll have 16 threads, where your 8 E cores can only do 1 thread each. The E cores are single threaded. They do not include the hyperthreading microarchitecture, or HT as Intel calls it. But then in that case, you're effectively getting 24 threads at various actual, virtual, performance, and efficiency levels. You'll be able to operate effectively 24 threads at any one time. Although that all sort of kind of flies out the window when you start talking about the fact that you have different types of cores. That mentality doesn't really stack up as much, and we'll talk a little more about that when we actually look at the benchmark scores that these processors kick out. So now, moving over to the Apple side of things, we're going to talk specifically about the M1 Max. But to know about the M1 Max is to know about the M1. The M1 and the M1 Max are effectively the same processor in the instruction set, in the cores. So when we talk about 8 performance cores on the Intel side, or 8 efficiency cores on the Intel side, when we talk about Golden Code and Gracemont, in the Alder Lake system, in the Alder Lake processor, we have the same type of thing over on the Apple side. But Apple shares those cores across multiple devices and multiple processors. So the M1 Max, and the M1 Pro, and the A14 Bionic all share the exact same cores. So we're going to go back in time just a little bit and talk about the A13 Bionic. The A13 Bionic is the chip that came out in the iPhone 12 last year in 2020. So not the A15 that is in the Apple iPhone 13. So the A14 Bionic processor that came in the 2020 Apple iPhone 12 and 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max is very similar to what we just described in the Intel Alder Lake processor. It is a big little hybrid configuration. Again, Apple's been doing this for a long time in the iPhone. And generally speaking, this is not new in mobile processors, again, to maximize efficiency, to maximize power. Now the A14 Bionic, the A14 in the iPhone 12, is a 6-core processor in a big little configuration with 2 of the performance cores and 4 of the efficiency cores. Those performance cores are called Firestorm, and the efficiency cores are called Ice Storm. I like the descriptions that Apple uses on those because the Firestorm cores get hot, they are high performance, and the Ice Storm cores are supposed to stay cool and not use as much power. So I kind of like the way that they illustrate that with the names. If you look at the A15 that is in the Apple iPhone 13 and 13 Pro and Pro Max, it has a different set of cores. Those are called Avalanche and Blizzard, and they are both designed to be low power, even though Avalanche is actually the version of the performance core. And it is very fast, but because it's using the new 5nm technology from TSMC, it actually sips battery and uses considerably less battery life than the equivalent Firestorm cores. But because of the fact that the M1 came out in 2020, And so did the A14 Bionic. Those are built on the same architecture, even though we are now at the end of 2021, now into 2022, and we're still talking about these processors because they're likely going to have an 18 plus month life cycle. So with Firestorm and with Ice Storm, you have 2 performance cores and you have 4 high efficiency cores in the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max. But in the M1, the laptop and desktop variant of the processor, and also what they put in the iPad Pro last year, was a 4 and 4 configuration. So it's actually an 8-core processor. It has 4 performance cores, still Firestorm, and 4 of the high efficiency cores, still Ice Storm, still the 2020 version of these processors. Where they really differentiated on the M1 was with storage, RAM, and also with the graphics. You could get a bin version of the graphics that was attached for either 8 cores or 7 cores. But again, it is the exact same basic baseline architecture of what you find in the A14 Bionic. Now, they did a whole bunch of stuff to the M1, they added a bunch of components, and they made it super fast, but again, it is the same underlying technology. Now, we jump to the M1 Max. I'm gonna skip the M1 Pro, just pretend that everything is the same in the Pro as it is in the Max, except the Max basically has double what the Pro has. The M1 Max has the same Ice Storm cores and Firestorm cores, but to maximize performance over efficiency, it actually has 8 of the Firestorm cores. So it has 8 P cores and 2 of the E cores. So 2 of the Ice Storm cores and 8 of the Firestorm cores. So it is a super high performance machine for things like email and basic productivity and surfing the web and all that sort of thing. But it also has this huge block of super high performance cores to give you the maximum amount of power possible. Now, that can inhibit battery life a little bit, but again, these ARM processors are super efficient. So even the performance cores run at very low power levels for what they actually give you. Apple also included things like H.264 and H.265 HEVC encode-decode units, ProRes encode-decode units, a 16-core neural engine, the fabric that attaches these cores together, and the RAM and the huge performance that you get out of the the on-chip SSD. There is so much that this chip has to offer. But in comparing those actual CPU cores, right, those 8P cores, 2E cores in the M1 Max, and we look at that compared to what Alder Lake, what Intel is offering with their new HK variant. You can't just throw like a 125 TDP desktop processor in a laptop. I mean, you can, but it's going to need so much cooling, and it's going to need a giant power brick, and it won't really be able to run on a battery for more than 20 minutes. And so they make different versions of those chips in order to meet different market segments. Now, the Apple M1 Max and M1 Pro, we've never been given exactly what it's designed for as far as its TDP, its thermal threshold, but in testing, we've determined that it's somewhere in about 45, but for the actual CPU component, though with the rest of it, it can actually get up to 100 watts. I've seen that on my 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro. Intel normally makes 100 or 95 watt, 65 watt, and 45 watt versions. So while Apple is not specifically telling us what the thermal rating is for those processors, and they're really just managing it with some fans in things like the MacBook Pros and the Mac Mini, or no fan in the MacBook Air, Intel is coming out with different variations because they have to deliver those chips out to OEM manufacturers like Asus and HP and Dell and Alienware so that they can actually build those machines and set them up properly with cooling and power. One big difference with Alder Lake is that Intel has created turbo mode, where the processors that would normally be 125 watts, 95 watts, 65 watts, 45 watts on the desktop side can now go up to 200 plus, almost 300 watts to achieve full power in some of these cases, which from my understanding has been very difficult for even enthusiasts on the desktop side to be able to cool appropriately with air, and that's just been a frustrating part of the Alder Lake release. Now looking at the laptop side of things, when you're releasing a 45 or 65 or lower watt part, you have to be very tight with your power usage. So when we take a look at the Intel mobile roadmap, H, N, and U variants. Now, K is traditionally a variant that you see on the desktop side of things, and your H variant that you see on the performance mobile side, that's normally the chip that you're looking at for your higher end productivity and content creation laptops. And that's no different for Alder Lake here. We're seeing anywhere from 12 to 45 watts of power being used by Alder Lake in the high-end H configuration, up to 14 cores, which is your kind of 8 and 6 or 6 and 8 configuration, where you've got 6P cores, 8E cores. So in that case, you would be looking at 20 threads, where your 6 performance cores with hyper-threading are going to be able to do 12 threads, and your 8 efficiency cores are going to be able to do 8 threads. So together you've got 20 threads. And of course, they're going to come with support for Thunderbolt 4 and DDR5, and they're going to come with the new graphics engine, the Z or XE. I'm not really sure how you're supposed to say that, but the XEZ, the new Intel graphics hardware, which is definitely an improvement over their previous built-in hardware, which may mean that for some of these enthusiast laptops or content creation laptops, you won't actually need to have dedicated off-chip video. Another advantage on the Apple side is that you have very high-end video, though not for games, but good for content creation, video editing, photo editing, 3D content creation, and that you're going to have that built into the processor as opposed to needing a secondary GPU from AMD or NVIDIA, as these Intel units will need if they want to get better than the baseline graphics that they're going to come with, even though they are improved. So as we look at what's going to be available from Intel in the mobile space, we're seeing a 45 watt thermal envelope. We're seeing 6 performance cores, 8 efficiency cores, running at various frequencies with access to Thunderbolt 4 and DDR5 with PCI Express 4 and 5 on the chip. So now, about a month and a half ago in November, we saw a Geekbench score. And of course, you've got to always take these with a grain of salt because you don't know what the actual configuration is or what the rest of the device might be. But this is from a Lenovo laptop running a Core i7 12800 HK. So that is your high-end variant of the Alder Lake mobile processor with 14 cores, 6 performance cores, and 8 of the efficiency cores at 2.9 gigahertz. And this particular processor in Geekbench 5 racked up a single core score. So that's one of those cores, the performance cores, one of those 6 performance cores. Remember, that is our Golden Cove processor, racked up 1,751 score on Geekbench, 1751. So that's the single core score, okay? And then a multi-core score, which is all of those processors, all 6 of the performance cores and 8 of the efficiency cores, and it ended up with a 6438. Now, of course, this was on Windows 11. We don't know if drivers, and configuration of BIOS was even anywhere near where it needed to be in November to be able to support the hybrid big little configuration on these mobile chips. But since then, we have seen new numbers. So then later on in November, we actually got some newer scores. This one from a Gigabyte laptop running a Core i7 12800H, still with 14 cores. So those 6 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores, though probably clocked slightly lower than the Core i9 variant. And it actually brought in a higher score on the multi-core score. So the single core score was 1654 and the The multi-core score was a 9618, so a significant boost over that previous score, much, much better, and probably due to fine-tuning BIOS and drivers for these new Alder Lake chips. This Core i7 was running at 2.8 gigahertz versus 2.9, so even though it was technically slower than the Core i9 that we saw a few weeks earlier, it was actually running faster, again, likely due to those improvements in BIOS and drivers. But now, just last week, we have new scores, again, this time from Razer, with the same processor. This is the Core i7 2.8 gigahertz, 12800H, with 6 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores, but in this case, it got a score of 1796 on the single core. And remember, that is the Golden Cove core, and 12258 on the multi-core score, which is a combination of those P cores and E cores, the Golden Cove and the Gracemont E cores. So all of that together, all 14 cores, all 20 threads. That's where this is going to become kind of interesting. So we have 6 performance cores, 8 efficiency cores, and we got a combined score of 12,250, 258. Those performance cores can actually do 2 threads at a time. So they're effectively working like 2 cores, like 12 cores instead of 6, with 20 total threads. So that has been the progression of these Alder Lake chips. So the question is, can these Alder Lake chips, now with these scores and with, it looks like, drivers and BIOS really kind of getting fine-tuned, as we anxiously wait to see these get released in the first quarter of 2022, where will they stack up against the M1 Max with 10 cores? So giving the Intel chips kind of the benefit of the doubt, and if you're looking at the Core i7, about 1790, 1800 on the single core score for just those Golden Cove by themselves, and about 12,000, call it 12,500 on average. Some of them have been as high as 1,200 or 12,600, some as low as 12,250. Now, of course, keep in mind, there will be an i9 variant that will be tweaked slightly higher in the clock department. So it'll have a probably 2.9 gigahertz core clock as opposed to the 2.8 gigahertz core clock that we have on the i7. So there you might see a 2 to 3% improvement in performance if each actual clock increases by a 1-to-1 ratio, if it is in fact that efficient of a processor. We'll give them, again, the benefit of the doubt and say that it'll be about 3% faster. So now, if we take the M1 Max with the 10 CPU cores, right, those 8 Firestorm cores and 2 Ice Storm cores, clocked at, I think, 2.3 gigahertz with anywhere between 16 and 64 gigabytes of RAM, and we compare that to the Alder Lake, what we end up with is that they are pretty much neck and neck. The Mac is running at about 1773, 1775 on average on the single core, right? That's the Firestorm core, and about 12,600 on the multi-core score. So that's a combination of all 10 cores put together. So this might look like a win for Intel, but let me just throw a little bit of cold water on that. The M1 Max is based on the A14 Bionic processor. It is now the winter, the first month now. Today is the first day of January 2022. So that processor is market-wise 15 months old. In terms, again, to the cores that are in it, that Firestorm and Ice Storm core. These Alder Lake chips haven't even been released yet in these variants. But giving Intel the benefit of the doubt, let's call them fall 2021. So they're a year behind in terms of releasing that and being able to get a mobile processor that is this same type of performance. We do not know what kind of power requirements are going to be needed here to get these processors to operate. They might be in a 45-watt thermal envelope, but we don't know what kind of turbo mode options there will be, and we don't know what happens as far as battery life and power consumption when these things really start to ramp up. From a content creation, productivity side of things, with 8 efficiency cores, there's a lot that this processor will be able to do for Windows users, but we don't know how the 6 performance cores will compare to the 8 performance cores in the M1 Max, and also we don't know how well the encode decode units or the encode decode components in the Intel graphics processor will do in comparison to your video editing capability that you have using Metal on Mac OS. I know that's kind of apples and oranges, but you know where I'm going with that. We'll kind of have to see how that goes. I'm sure a lot of people will be doing tests with DaVinci Resolve and comparing Premiere Pro on both platforms. I am actually very excited for this development from Intel, primarily because of the fact that it shows competition in the market. One thing that we've seen almost immediately, both from Qualcomm on the mobile side of things, and also now from Intel on the desktop side of things, is that having multiple players in this market is helpful. Having Apple push these other vendors, having them push these other manufacturers to do more, to do better, is good. That's good for the consumer because it gives us more options. It gives us more technology, just like having AMD come into the desktop space and really, really hit Intel where it hurt at the top of the market, at the server side of the market, really has pushed Intel to try to get back on the horse as far as manufacturing is concerned. So I'm very excited for all of this. It's going to be super fun this year to see what comes out and how these things perform. If you're an Intel user, Windows user, and this is the type of thing that you're looking for, if you are on your way to upgrading your laptop, let me know down in the comments if this is something that's going to push you to make that leap, or if you've been looking at the Mac, if you've been looking at the M1 Max, the M1 Pro, and whether or not that is going to do it for you. I'd be very curious to get your input down in the comments. If you like videos like this, if you're into gear, if you're into nerd talk about cores and chips and frequencies and all that sort of thing, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Go ahead and hit the like button on this video, and don't forget to hit the bell so that you're notified when I make a new video. Also, my last plug for the channel, I told you at the beginning I was going to plug the channel again at the end, okay? So if you would please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'm trying really hard to get to 10,000 subscribers here. I was really trying to do it by the end of 2021. I didn't make it happen. Sorry, I got busy. My wife and I had a baby. But now that I'm in 2022, hoping that I can get to 10K and maybe even further by the end of this year, go ahead and find me over on Instagram. I am at jblakePhoto. And also, if you haven't seen or if you're at all interested in some of my outdoor adventure photography, go ahead and check out my last video. It's part 1 of my trip over to the Mammoth Lakes area in California. Just a beautiful area. I had a great time a couple months back taking some photos, just taking a weekend trip. So check that out. Part 2 coming soon. And I really appreciate your interest in that video if that's something that you're into. And I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who has been following my channel from the beginning, from when I made my first video about not being a hipster with a man bun, that I'm just a big nerd who likes talking about gear and photography and drones and computers and video editing and photography and cinematography and did I say photography? It's the stuff that I love, and I love talking about it, and this channel is a labor of love for me. It's not a job. This is not my job. I have a job. I do this extra. I do this for fun on my own. This is my self-care. And so I really enjoy doing it, and I enjoy the support that I get from it. And it doesn't hurt when people support me or when I can make a little bit of extra money on the side with it. So I really appreciate everyone's support over the last few years, and specifically in these last 2 years with the COVID pandemic. I know it's been tough. We're all getting through it as best we can. So it's 2022. I hope you all are very safe. I hope you had a great New Year's Eve. Have a great new year. Stay safe. Get vaccinated. Get your booster. Wear a mask. And hopefully we all have a great year this year. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one.